Welcome to the Diesel Podcast presented by DFC Diesel. Stuart, I'm excited to chat with you today about EPA, emissions, deletes, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure a lot of our listeners and viewers on YouTube are familiar with you. So welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Patrick. You know, I'm always happy to come on the podcast and help in any way I can.
Well, I thought it'd be cool this time because depending on the episode we do and when we're covering it, there could be this influx of new people that are catching the video. They might not have heard the ones we've done over the years. So I wanted to have you spend a little bit of time and tell me, well, not me because I know, but tell our audience, new listeners, about yourself and your specific work in this topic of the Clean Air Act and representing clients in cases that pertain to them violating the Clean Air Act.
Sure. So, I went to business school and then I went to law school here in Denver. I live in Boulder, but it's 20 minutes away. And when I graduated from law school, it was in 2006, and when I passed the bar was in 2007. And my first job as a lawyer was working for ATS Diesel. And Clint Cannon is a good friend of mine. He's been a friend of mine for almost 20 years now. And, that time that I graduated from law school, I went to go work in-house for ATS, which means I was there 2 or 3 days a week, every single week. And it was right around the time that the emissions controls were being mandated for diesel. So 2007 and a half was the first model year, right? And Clint and I were really curious about the impact of the emissions controls and how it was going to affect performance. And, I was a really young attorney, didn't really know all that much about diesels or vehicles in general, but we traveled around. We traveled to California, sat in on rulemaking sessions where they were actually talking about the emissions controls. We traveled to Canada where they were, creating some of the new DPF and SCR systems. And a lot of this was for business to try to figure out what we could do business wise. But over the course of that time and working at the ATS facility in Arvada, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about diesels. I had a 2004 Duramax, and I had a bunch of ATS parts on it, and we worked on it, and I just developed a lot of knowledge about the industry over that time. In about 2012, I believe, ATS got a carb enforcement action. And so it wasn't an EPA enforcement action. They weren't really doing the enforcements at that time, but they were getting ready to. And CARB was one of the company or one of the states that was starting to do the enforcements as well. And so I went through the CARB enforcement process with ATS, and they said you weren't allowed to sell certain parts into California. And we ended up negotiating a deal with them and moving on. And as you know, ATS has been a compliant company for quite a long time, pretty much since 2011 or 2012. And it was during that time, the 2012 to probably 2016 or 2017, that I really got to know and became educated on the Clean Air Act and the CARB rules, the state of California's independent rules. And then in 2019, as you know, the National Compliance Initiative came out under the first Trump administration. Then that was mandating the enforcement of the Clean Air Act on companies that were selling aftermarket feed devices. And this was in the wake of the Volkswagen scandal and all the rest of the manufacturers that were doing this on the OEM side. So in 2019, because I had been working with ATS and some other companies in the industry for a while, my name started going out as a lawyer who knew what they were doing. And that's when I represented Ryan Milliken the first time that he got a request for information. And after that, my practice pretty much went, from doing mostly courtroom stuff here in the Denver area and criminal defense and things like that to, I'd say, probably 70% diesel enforcement cases. And so I've gotten, over the course of the last 6 years, very intimately involved with the industry as it relates to enforcement actions. And I've also developed relationships with companies around and, of course, with the government. I work with EPA agents and EPA lawyers and EPA investigators and U.S. attorneys' offices around the country. So that's where we are today. Where we are today is been doing primarily the EPA stuff for about the last 6 years.
Hey, Diesel fans, wanted to let you guys know that our friends over at Kershaw Knives have a 40% off MSRP code for you. If you go to kershaw.kaiusa.com, use code TDP2540, you get your 40% off MSRP. It's a great way to save some money, get some cool gear if you're in the market for a new EDC knife, something for hunting, fishing, around the job site, around the house. They've got you covered with a bunch of different choices for blade steel, opening mechanisms, handle designs, and their whole lineup is designed to meet any budget that you might have. So we really appreciate them offering that discount code just for Diesel Podcast listeners. So if you're in the market, head on over to kershaw.kaiusa.com, use code TDP2540, and get 40% off MSRP. I think one of the reasons, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them that I really love chatting with you about these topics is because you bridge so many different parts of this diesel space that would be hard to find. If somebody said, Patrick, go find a lawyer to get on the podcast to ask these emissions questions, I might be able to find some. I probably could. But are they going to know intimately how the industry works from either your work with a manufacturer or a series of manufacturers to getting to know individual shop owners to knowing how the entire industry functions? It's very unique. And the way you're able to relate that to questions that I'm going to ask you in topics, today and in the past about parts, enforcement, things like that. So I think that's really important for us to start. So anyone who's new that's listening to this, they have some background on you. I wanted to transition that into, earlier this year we talked about what's going to happen with the new administration. Is delete enforcement going to go away? Are we going to be able to buy trucks that don't have emission systems on them? And now we're 4 months later, 3 months later, and I know that there's been some developments that we've seen on the news, in the press with different organizational things within the EPA and stuff like that. But you're on the front lines. You're working, representing diesel shops or individuals in cases pertaining to the Clean Air Act and the federal government. Has there been any change on your end with lack of enforcement? Have they just dropped off? Is the volume not what it used to be, or is it about the same?
So, that's a great question. I would say enforcement has definitely not dropped off. It is about the same as it was. There's been a moderate slowdown in the resolution of the cases, and there has been quite a significant impact in the resources that are available to prosecute or litigate the EPA cases. And when I say that, I mean many U.S. attorneys' offices on the criminal side, not only relating to environmental crime, but many U.S. attorneys' offices have lost a bunch of lawyers who have decided that their politics didn't line up with the administration, or that they didn't want to be U.S. attorneys anymore. And there's a hiring freeze on federal prosecutors and most federal employees, okay, that don't have to do with strictly law enforcement or defense, the national defense, I should say. So, there has been a moderate slowdown in the resolution of these cases, meaning the EPA agents and the U.S. attorneys are not quite as persistent in trying to move the cases along. But I think I was telling you before the podcast, I mean, I've gotten a new case in Wyoming. I've got a couple cases on the East Coast. I've got a case in Georgia. All of these have come to me for grand juries or federal indictments over the course of the last month and a half. And when I speak with the EPA lawyers, who I know pretty well, EPA's criminal investigation division, which is sort of in charge of prosecuting that environmental crime, is one of their headquarters is here in Denver. When I talk to attorneys who are working with the EPA or investigators working with the EPA, they're very, very adamant and specific about the fact that the Trump administration, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Attorney General have not directed them or instructed them to stop enforcing on environmental crime. There are a lot of memos out there and a lot of direction from the U.S. Attorney's offices and the Attorney General, where the Attorney General is saying that environmental crime is less of a focus for the administration than things like immigration, anything to do with trade, like tariff violations, violent crime, major drug crimes, things that we heard about during the election and things that we heard about from the Trump administration over the course of the last 3 or 4 months. Those are going to be much higher priority for the administration, but there's been no indication to me, and there is no indication at all, because I look every single day, that environmental crimes are not going to be prosecuted and that deletes will at some point be legal. That is not going to happen, period.
That has been, I think, between social media, videos, things like that, and even I mentioned before the podcast, I see ads on different social media platforms for companies, and I don't know where they're at, selling a delete tuner or exhaust or EGR blocker plates, different things like that, where when I think about the previous, say, 6 years, I didn't see that. I didn't see it put in front of me for whatever reason, maybe pages I follow, whatever targeting that they use. It was just, it wasn't front and center. So it seemed like earlier this year there was a switch, and I think it really started with maybe people being hopeful, because we talked
Yeah,
about it on our last podcast. They want to go buy a brand new truck with all the bells and whistles, all the technology, and they just put diesel in it and drive it for 5, 6, 700,000 miles, and there's no emissions maintenance on them. But what you're telling me is in contrast to the culture of diesel trucks and information that has been out there for a long time. Like, part of it was they were supposed to be legal a few months ago. We're supposed to be able to go buy a truck with no emissions on it. That was going to be coming up, and we just haven't seen it yet. And I think the part that really jumps out to me are those new clients that you mentioned you have in 2025. Those are still taking place. So it hasn't stopped.
yeah. So there is a lot of hope in the industry that deletes will be legal. Okay, this is a false hope. This is not going to happen because are there are too many people who have been enforced upon and prosecuted, and there's too much money at stake for the OEM manufacturers who have invested literally billions of dollars in emissions controls and compliance systems. And I think if the Trump administration were to make a rule, or Congress were to pass a rule to say that emissions controls or deletes were to become legal, the real risk would be what happens in 4 years or 8 years to OEM manufacturers that you have a new administration, say it's a Democrat administration that comes in, and they say, we're going to re-implement the Green New Deal. We are going to increase or re-implement the mandates on electric vehicles and climate controls and everything else. And then all of a sudden, the OEMs are back where they started, where there's not a consistency with the government and the administrations that are coming in. And I think you can't really unring this bell for emissions controls. I think there's a lot of things you could do to improve the emissions controls, I think there's a lot of things that you can do to make them more efficient. I think that there's a lot of things that you can do to sort of change the narrative on those things. But to say across the board that deletes are going to be illegal is just it's a false hope. It's not going to happen. Okay. And the reason that I think that there's hope in the industry for some reform, which I think people should be hopeful for, is because you do have people out in the Congress, people like Clay Higgins, people like Corey Willis advocating for change on less fundamental make deletes illegal side of things, but more let's level the playing field and make things fair. Okay, I think that that's where people should have hope. And on social media, there's been this letter going around from Congressman Higgins to Lee Zeldin and to Pam Bondi. And that what this letter says is that there has been weaponization of uh, the legal system against small business owners, people like Corey Willis, who's referred to in the letter, and other people whose businesses are disproportionately affected by this enforcement, right? Whether it's on the criminal side or the civil side. Small businesses are much less likely or much less able to be able to pay a big fine to the EPA, or maybe even a medium or small sized fine to the EPA. And they don't have billions of dollars to be able to pay their penalties, whatever the EPA decides they might be. Okay. So the reason that I think people are hopeful, and I think they should be hopeful, is because it is now, Congress is now paying attention to the idea that the EPA and the Department of Justice and the U.S. attorney's offices around the country are not equally or appropriately enforcing the laws that we already have, right? The number one question that I get from my clients, and probably the number one question that I've answered on your podcast over the course of, how long has it been?
That's
3 or 4 years?
yeah, it's been a
6 years, baby.
while. Yeah.
Why is it that certain cases are civil and certain cases are criminal?
Yeah.
That's the number one question I get. I don't have an answer. In someone's mind with the EPA or the Department of Justice, somebody did something in each individual case which determined whether or not it was civil or criminal. Some are easier to spot than others. Like if you violated a consent decree, then that becomes criminal a lot more quickly. But I think, what people should be hopeful for in our industry, and what they should be hopeful for with regard to some kind of reform when it comes to the EPA, is standardizing and making consistent the enforcement of the laws that we have. The Clean Air Act, the various different tampering regulations, and then certain state laws. I've seen state cases brought recently. So that is something to be hopeful for, that if you sell 200 deletes, you're not gonna get charged with a felony or plead guilty to a felony or get thrown in prison. I think that that's something that's achievable and something that we can really reach for. I do not think it is something to hope for or something that's achievable for there to be a defunding or tearing down of the EPA and rote permission for deletes to be legal. That is not going to happen.
How often do you see discrepancies in your history of doing this? We say, I'm just throwing examples out there. Somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I got this letter. I did X amount of these, put these parts on or tuning, whatever it might have been, and you think, okay, they're probably going to get this dollar amount fine and move on with it, and it comes back criminal. Or somebody else contacts you and they're like, I did 1,500 of these. I'm in big trouble, and it's a fine that they pay. Is it, from your perspective, very inconsistent?
I see it all the time. It is extremely inconsistent. I've had clients who have had 10,000 delete sales with a single owner company that has been a civil case. I've had clients that have deleted a fleet of 13 trucks, their own trucks, because they couldn't afford to repair the emissions controls, and they have $100,000 fine and a permanent felony on their record. It is extremely inconsistent.
I think I think what you mentioned about an equal application of the law has more traction in my mind as something that would be possible to do versus rewriting part of a act and getting two chambers of Congress and the president to sign it. That seems more daunting to do versus I think everyone can get behind the idea of it's applied equally, you know what the standards are, and you can proceed
Yeah.
accordingly with it. So that's an interesting perspective, something that I haven't really seen a lot of talk on. It's been mostly like the floodgates opened and everything should happen. I think the reason that it also really hits home for me is some of the guests I've had on, the shop owners that have gone through this process. Some of them have gone to federal prison, some of them have got felonies, some
Mhm.
of them have been put out of business due to fines, and so it kind of hits a personal note with me, and why I get passionate about it and want to cover it and talk
Yeah.
to people about it. It's because it affects lives and livelihoods and families and
Yeah.
futures and things like that. So it can be difficult to navigate it, based on where you're getting where the information's coming from. How truthful is it? Um, you're playing around with a felony case or
Yeah. I
hundreds of
mean,
thousands of dollars.
there's activity on the congressional level, okay? But the activity is not what people are saying it is online. Like there's these CRAs that you see online that are going through the House and now they're going to be voted on in the Senate. And it's basically a vote of no confidence for certain EPA rules that have been put in place. One of these CRAs applies to stationary sources, not motor vehicles. Okay. And saying that, the regulations are too stiff on these. That one of them applies to the state of California's regulations being either implemented or marketed to be implemented around the country. Okay, the state of California has much more stringent environmental laws. And the EPA was using CARB as basically its engineering and technological arm for years to make sure that things were legal in their mind. That's how Corey had to agree to follow to get EOs for all of his parts as part of his settlement agreement, is because the EPA doesn't want to spend the resources to make sure that things are legal, and so they use California to do that because California is willing to dedicate the time and the resources to do that. Well, now in Congress, there's these CRAs that are going through that speak to the inappropriate way that the federal government, the EPA, is utilizing state resources and basically state rules to utilize on a national level.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's very appropriate legislation. I don't think that everyone in the country should be required to follow California's rules, the same as I don't think everybody in the country should be required to follow Idaho's rules or Texas's rules. I mean, one of the beautiful things about living in America is that you can move to the state that has the rules that you want to follow, right? Like that's one of the reasons that we love it here. If you want really liberal politics and you want high taxes, move to California. If you want much less liberal politics and you want to be able to do things that you can't do in California, you can move to Texas or Florida or wherever, right? So these CRAs are making their way through Congress, but they're not making, or nor do they even have the possibility of making deletes legal. That's not what they are. And I see this stuff online and I see this stuff on podcasts where people are like, it's happening. It's happening. You can see the CRA. It's going to happen next week. It's going to happen in 2 weeks. No, it's not. And you can call any lawyer who does any work in this space. And there are some really good lawyers that I work with who are on the defense side that work in this space who have at least as good of an understanding of the Clean Air Act as I do, probably better. And they're like, no, that's not what the CRAs say, you know? So I don't want your listeners to get false hope for the legislation that's going through. It's great that the EPA has reduced the size of its workforce. I think it's great, just from a purely financial perspective. I think it's great that the EPA is focusing on more things that matter as opposed to less things that matter. And I think it's great that the EPA is minimizing or eliminating the social justice requirements with ENRD. But to look at what the EPA and the federal government is doing with regard to the application onto our industry, you still cannot market, sell, advertise for sale, make available to purchase defeat devices. You definitely cannot install them onto customer vehicles. That's tampering. That is a felony. Full stop. That's the same thing that I talked about with Ryan Milliken, right? You cannot conspire or make an agreement with another company to sell or to tamper. You just can't do it. And there's just no reason to do it either. I mean, the technology that we have to improve the performance of our vehicles, it's never going to get back to the pre 2003, pre 2007 vehicles because the emissions are too high. But there have been some amazing developments in engineering and in our industry that really make the trucks run well, and that's what we should focus on.
One of the things I heard, I want to get your opinion on, is the idea of rolling back emissions to, was it 2009 standards or 10 or something like that, that I had heard about. I'm not sure if you have or have seen discussions or content about that. But as far as the viability of rolling back to an older standard, is that something that would even be on the table?
Um, what would the older standard be that we're rolling back to? Give me some hypotheticals. The answer is yes. It is possible that they could do a rollback of some of the existing standards. Like, for example, the amount of emissions, the amount of NOx, the amount of carbon dioxide, the amount that are permitted to be released into the environment from the tailpipe. It is possible that those rules can increase. Is it possible for those levels to be increased up to an amount that would go back to 2003, pre-EGR, or 2007, pre-SCR, pre-DPF? I don't think so. So what are we talking? What kind of rollback are we talking here?
Common question we get from you guys a lot is, hey, I need a diesel engine. I either, I can't wait this long to get one, or normal place I get stuff from it just takes too long, or they don't have the parts in it that I need. Maybe my truck's not stock or I tow heavy with it. I don't want to go back with just a stock engine. DFC Diesel is a sponsor of the podcast. We worked with them, hand in hand on doing episodes, answering technical questions. They have a complete lineup of Cummins, Duramax, and Power Stroke remanufactured engines that are set to a standard of ISO 9001 2015 standards, which is a huge deal in the aftermarket. And there's certain levels of quality testing, validation that are required for that. So when you get one of those engines, the type of quality that's built behind it with an industry-leading warranty that's really comprehensive. And the other thing with that is, sometimes the options that are out there, it's a basic OEM engine. You want a little bit more. You don't want to have the same failure again. So there's a bunch of different series of engines that they have, from core, street, tow haul, and also the speed of air series, which we've covered on the podcast before. There's a lot of really cool benefits to it. And if you have questions about that, reach out to them. If you don't know the type of engine that you're looking for, if you go to dfcdiesel.com, there's a ton of info there. You can send an email or you can reach out to them. Also, they're working with speed of air pistons, which it's the only piston that pays for itself. And there's a lot of really cool technology behind it. So you can add that into your build and be able to get better fuel economy, increased power, increased torque, and better engine life out of it. Some of the most common engine applications or series of engines that they have with that lead time, a lot of them are in stock or they have really short lead times. So you can check your favorite retailer or go to dfcdiesel.com, check them out, see what's in stock, see what you can get. If you have questions, maybe you want to do something that's outside of the normal series of engines, they have tons of choices for rods, cranks, pistons, valve train upgrades, tons of different things. So if you're in the market, definitely make sure and head on over and check them out. Yeah, well, that's what's tough, and I'm naive when it comes to this, but a long time ago, I did a podcast with somebody on the history of Dodge trucks, and through just different conversations I've had over the years, I didn't know way back when that what drove these changes in engines was emissions. I didn't understand the reason to go from a 12 valve to the VP44 to the common rail to even the changes between 03, 04 to 04.5 to 07 and changes with the 6 liters and 6.4s and Duramaxes and everything else was based on a future standard that the OEMs needed to meet. And that's what was driving the changes in either injection system, turbos, EGRs, all these things. So I guess
They're good changes, right?
well,
I mean, as
some of our
far as
audience will say no. It depends
well,
what it is.
okay, but you can't tell me that a common rail doesn't perform better than a 12 valve.
It does.
And
Yeah.
you can't tell me that a turbocharger on a common rail doesn't perform better than a 12 valve. Like that's just not true, right? Like you can reducing emissions also in many cases means increasing performance. Not when it relates to a DPF or an SCR or anything like that, right?
Right.
But in general, more efficiency means less emissions and more power.
Right. I would agree with that. I would say that through that, the trucks got better. They made more power.
Yeah.
There was, they became better trucks. When it all changed was that 2007 and a half model year. And I don't know why. I probably should have prepared more or went back to my YouTube history or whatever video I was watching. But I think it was 2009 or 10 or something. And again, I'm naive, and there's probably somebody watching this that is way more knowledgeable about it than me. But my first thought when I heard of rolling back to something like that, I thought, okay, well, we still had DPFs, we still had EGRs on these trucks. I'm
Yeah.
sure that the changes throughout the years were for something stricter coming up, but I just wasn't sure how viable that could be in the context of our conversation today. Like we talked about
Yeah.
equal application of penalties or of the law, the weaponization that you had mentioned, some of the CRAAS going around, these other things. And I thought, okay, well, what about not having these standards keep on getting stricter to where I think ultimately from a truck owner's perspective, I don't know what percentage it would be, maybe 95%, maybe a little higher. I don't think they care about making 700, 800, 900 horsepower. I really don't. I think they
Yeah.
want to buy a truck, have it be reliable, and when something fails, they don't want to spend $10,000 to $15,000 to put
Yes.
something back on.
100%.
That's what they want. So,
One thing so I think we can all agree that nobody wants to roll back the technology to 2010,
no,
right? I mean, that was like the absolute worst of the worst when it came to the reliability and performance of the post-emission trucks.
yeah,
Anywhere from 2008 to 2012, or if you had a Ford 2014, maybe, I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, they can roll back, and they probably will roll back the ambient air standards and the emission standards that are coming out of the tailpipe of these mobile sources. That, like, it's just they're not going to roll back all of the emissions controls. Another thing that Congress could do, or that certain states could do, I suppose, is give rebates or mandates to customers who have to pay this. I think Corey refers to it as the climate tax, right? Like, let's give, if your emissions controls fail in the first 10 years of you owning a vehicle, even if it's out of warranty, we're going to give you a free DPF or a free SCR system or something, and make the manufacturers pay for that. And that will encourage innovation and encourage the manufacturers to come up with the most reliable emissions controls possible, as opposed to, oh, your emissions controls went out, so sorry, pay me 15 grand, you have to have it on here, right? I mean, those are options. Those are definitely options that I don't think people are thinking. Well, maybe some people are thinking about it that way, but it just like getting rid of the Clean Air Act and getting rid of the EPA and getting rid of the emissions controls on the diesels. I mean, these are the energy in our industry should not be spent hoping that's going to happen.
With what you do, you're representing clients in these cases. You're on the defense side, right? So I'm sure there's lots of you have an interest in representing them. That's what your job is. That's what you're paid to do and what you've chosen to do with your career. Do you find that there's any sort of information or willingness to get your feedback or work with you at the federal level, like with different either entities or higher ups or different attorneys' offices as it pertains to this?
I'm trying to I'm trying to work on that now. Like I said, I've sent letters out to people who I think might be interested in hearing my perspective or my client's perspective. I'm not a super political person. I don't have a, I don't really have a political footprint. I live in Denver. I don't live in DC or LA or Chicago or New York or anywhere like that. I think if there's different senior management at the EPA, they might be interested in some kind of a, discussion about the impact on the industry. It's just that I haven't seen it yet. I think it's just a little bit too new. That might happen in a year or two where people, respond to my letters, or they reach out to me and they say, hey, we've noticed you doing podcasts, or you have a presence in these cases. We'd like to hear about ideas that you have. I don't think that aftermarket defeat devices are or will ever be a priority for the Trump administration. I really don't. I don't think Trump gives a crap about aftermarket defeat cases. This is low level stuff. This is not immigration. It's not major crimes. It's not violent crimes. It's not drugs. It's not anything related to trade. And, we do have parts coming in, I guess, from Canada and China, which could see some impact, but I haven't seen any indication from the Trump administration that our industry is a priority for it. And I hope that that changes in the future.
Yeah, I can see some crossover with some of the themes and some of the things that the administration's talked about. I think the huge one is
Yeah.
weaponization of departments and things like that. And I've read things that Corey has said and other people as it relates to this application of civil criminal. And I think everyone wants, they would love to have it be equally applied, or exactly what the standards are to cross that threshold versus some of the examples you gave of it not being criminal in one case or another. There were
Mhm.
some questions that I've been compiling since we chatted last, and some of them pertain to exactly what we're talking about. I wanted to ask you there. I
Yeah.
didn't prep you. I didn't send them to you beforehand. Um,
No, rapid fire.
one of them I got, and I don't know, and I wouldn't say if I did what where their content's released. But they said, if I talk about or show deleted trucks on social media or YouTube, can I be held liable? I thought that would be a great question to ask you.
Yeah. Short answer is no. People do it all the time. End users are not a priority for the EPA or DOJ. Longer answer is that if you're showing those clips in conjunction with the sale or the marketing or the installation of defeats, then the EPA will see that. They have a lot of researchers out there that go on social media and get information that way. So if you're just a guy, if you're Patrick, you don't have a shop, you show clips of deleted vehicles on your podcast or whatever, you're probably fine. But if you're like a shop where you're posting it in conjunction with something that you might be advertising to sell or advertising to sell on behalf of someone else, like, hey, check out this company in Oklahoma City, they do some really cool stuff, then you might have some exposure.
Do you have to be so specific with referencing the sale that way? Or if somebody said, say they had a truck that they come with a DPF and EGR, and they say something like, oh, we put some parts that make this truck run better on this, and you see a video and somebody stabs the throttle and smoke comes out, which it wouldn't if it had the DPF on. Would that be something? Is that kind of a gray area, or is that kind of similar to?
Are you saying whose parts they are?
No, they would just be saying it would be a shop, not an individual. They'd say, "Oh, we put some or made this truck run better, let it breathe, or made it reliable." But it's being insinuated through the content that there's no longer DPF on it, and there's not an EGR, and it runs great now.
It depends how many clips you have. I mean, if you post 100 clips like that, you're going to get the EPA's attention. If you post two, they're probably not going to do anything.
The other question I got, you've answered kind of right there, but somebody said, does EPA just or did they prosecute individuals or just shops and companies that perform deletes? Have you ever heard of anyone, maybe even at the state level might be more common, that's gotten in trouble as an individual for having a deleted truck?
No. I've never on the state or the federal level seen anybody get in trouble for having a deleted truck. I've seen people be required to put it back to stock. I've seen it not get a registration. I've seen it not get a smog test. I've never seen anyone get in trouble for having a deleted truck.
So pretty much the enforcement and the responsibility, it's not on the end user, it's on the company or the installer of the products is where all the focus has been pretty much your entire career.
Unless the end user has a fleet. Unless the end user, and granted, that's a company, right? But the EPA is very interested in prosecuting companies that are putting over the road heavy duty diesels that have been deleted on the road because of the volume of emissions. Okay, so like you're like a owner operator of a vehicle and you're taking loads from point A to point B, they're probably not going to do anything to you. But if you have 5, 6, 10 trucks and you have a fleet and they're deleted, you might get charged.
Okay, so say, as an example, I owned a construction company and I had 30 trucks in it,
Yeah.
and I deleted all 30, but I'm not a diesel shop.
Target.
Okay,
Prime target.
that's interesting and something I haven't thought about. I guess my focus has always sort of been on the shop or the company manufacturing the product, not Fleece, but Fleece is a huge part of.
You're sort of in the performance world, which makes a difference, right? And also in the light heavy duty world where you're talking about, Cummins Power Stroke, Duramax, that's like your main target audience. a huge area of emphasis for the EPA has been for years and continues to be agriculture, farm equipment, over-the-road vehicles, stationary sources, which are like power plants and things like that. We don't hear a lot about, but that is a huge area of emphasis for the EPA. What they're interested in, the bigger the motor, the bigger the penalty. So the reason that they're interested in fleets is because you have a construction company and you have 30 vehicles and they're all deleted. Like that's a lot of emissions, right? So, and it, if I mean you're talking about excavators, that's even more, right? So those are very attractive targets for EPA enforcement.
This next question, it really ties into the previous ones I've asked you. Somebody said, how does the EPA track down violations? Is it through like social media or somebody complain, or how does it happen? So I'm
Yeah.
thinking of the video that might be on social media as a shop, a diesel shop or a fleet or something like that. What has your experience been with how does the EPA find out about this?
It's almost always a snitch. Disgruntled employee, disgruntled ex-girlfriend, disgruntled ex-boyfriend, disgruntled person who got injured on your property. They have a hotline and people call into the hotline and they say, I know this company is selling hundreds of deletes. The guy, I got into an argument with him about overtime. He wouldn't pay me. Or my ex-boyfriend is running a shop and he's doing deletes out there. That's the number one way, or maybe 1A and 1B. 1B would be a response to an RFI or a previous enforcement. So if I'm preparing an RFI and I'm sending invoices out on behalf of my clients and I'm producing them to the government, and they all come from DSLR or CTT or Proven or whatever, the EPA is compiling a database of all the people who have violated. And they use that for two purposes. Number one, to establish the criminality of the conduct, meaning if you have invoices where you're not saying that this is a delete and you're seeing that this is like a weight loss or this is like a EGR fix or something like that, they view that as criminal activity based on intent. So that's one way that they get the data from other companies. Another way that they're getting the data from other companies is volume. So if you've got 16 shops in North Carolina that are all buying product from one company, and that company is it's got 100 sales, then the EPA is going to know that they have 1,600 sales in that area. So, people think they can hide it on their Facebook. They think that they can create an invoice that doesn't say delete, but the EPA has already got a lot of information by the time they even set foot in your shop or they even contact you. They already probably know how many you've sold or roughly how many you've bought. So you got to think about that. If you're trying to avoid enforcement, it's not going to do you any favors to write, DPF replacement on an invoice unless you have evidence that you bought a DPF filter. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, so it can work as far as that information, as far as them finding that. So it could, if I'm understanding correctly, it could be two ways. It could be somebody gets a request for information, you're involved with it, you produce these invoices of all these parts that have been sold, and they, I don't know, say they see that EGR fix from company A and they see 40 of them. Then they would say, "Oh, we need to see what company A. How many are they selling around the country?" Can it also
Yeah.
work the other way, where maybe it doesn't start with the shop; it starts with company A who makes the
Yeah.
EGR fix, and then they say, "Well, where did they get shipped to? Where were they distributed throughout the country?"
Yep. That's exactly right. I mean, there's a million ways that they can do it. They can just randomly walk into a shop in Texas and see that somebody has a Minimax on the shelf. That's possible, but the two biggest ways are previous response to an RFI or a subpoena or a disgruntled employee. I'd say probably 70% of my cases come from a disgruntled employee. People who are pissed off and they threaten. I had one case where somebody got hurt at my client's shop and he went to claim workers' comp and my client wouldn't put the workers' comp claim through. And he said, well, F you, I'm going to report you to the EPA. And the guy was like, okay, go ahead. And then he did. And then my client got in a lot of trouble. So it's not, I mean, it happens a lot.
It's good information. The other question is probably one of the most common, and I don't know if I know the answer. I mean, I think I do, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Are there any exemptions to emissions compliance for off-road, race only, older vehicles? Are there any exemptions in the eyes of the EPA and what you deal with, work with every day?
Yeah, we've talked about this, but it's been a long time. So it's good to bring it up again. Um, there are exemptions for true race vehicles trailered to a race or not registered. Okay. And if you're a shop and you're working on true race vehicles, of which I have a lot of clients who do that, um, take photos, show the build, make sure you have photos that this vehicle came into your shop without a license plate. Make sure you have pictures of it racing on a strip, show it on a trailer somewhere so that I did this for what's his face? PFI Speed, Brent up in Fort Lupton, right here down the street, running a real race shop, doing real race vehicles. And he's a YouTuber. I think his case has been documented pretty extensively online. And we provided the EPA with evidence that these were real race vehicles. And it was an effective defense. Okay. But they've got to be real race vehicles. It doesn't work if you say, oh, it's a race application. We call that the Gearbox Z case, right? They said, oh, we've got all these race vehicles. And the EPA is like, yeah, you're selling 3,500 race parts in whatever, 6 months. I don't think so. Right. So it's got to be a real race vehicle. That's one exemption. Off-road, yes, but remember that doesn't apply to farm or ag equipment. So if you have a John Deere or a Husqvarna or something and it comes with a DPF, you can't take it off because it's off-road. That doesn't fly. Okay. I've had probably about 10 farm ag cases. The EPA doesn't love the ag cases because it's really affecting someone's livelihood. Like if your vehicle is not in the field, it can be a problem. Like financially, I mean, your business can go under, right? But they are out there and they do happen. So off-road doesn't apply to ag equipment and certain other equipment or race vehicles that are not on the road. Okay. I don't know. You tell me if the new like sports equipment like marine and stuff has emissions controls. You can't take those off, even though they're off road, right? And then there are exceptions for emergency vehicles and law enforcement vehicles. And if you can demonstrate that they are that they've had a failure. If they've had a failure in the field, and you can prove that they've had a failure in the field, you can take the emissions controls off. And that's a very rare thing that happens, think like a, 6'4" ambulance, right? Or, something along those lines. It's very rare, but it does happen.
Just to be clear, for someone who's listening or watching, this is just for emergency use, law enforcement type vehicles. It's not somebody has an individual truck and they went through 3 or 4 DPFs and they say, "Well, I can take it off now." This is
Only certified EVs, not electronic vehicles, emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances, SWAT trucks, real emergency vehicles, not just I've got a big truck and I'm going to use the EV exception. Doesn't count in the oil field, doesn't count on the farm, doesn't that it's got to be a real EV.
okay. All right, my last question for you. I'm not sure if you've come across this. It might be a little outside of your scope, but I couldn't think of anybody better to ask. Can a deleted truck be legally sold or traded in?
No, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen all the time. So, a dealership is not, a dealership is allowed to buy a deleted vehicle if they're going to put it back to stock. Okay. So I guess in that sense, you could sell, it is legal for you to sell to a dealership or trade it in, right? You are not allowed, if you're a dealership or a reseller, to put that vehicle back on the road without compliance. Okay. It doesn't matter if you have smog or emissions in your state. It doesn't matter if you're selling it to a friend. You have to make it compliant before it goes back on the road legally. But then we go back to our first question that you asked about, maybe it was your first question you asked about the end users.
Yeah.
Like if I delete my vehicle and I sell it to my buddy and he drives it and there's no emissions test in my state, is anyone going to know? No, probably not. That won't work in Colorado. It won't work in California. It won't work in New York. But it probably would work in Texas or, Idaho or wherever, right? But dealerships are different. Remember, Sean and Tracy Coiteau had their dealership up in Tacoma, and Tracy was convicted of 11 counts of tampering and 1 count of conspiracy. Her case is on appeal right now. They owned a dealership. They were either accepting and reselling deleted vehicles or maybe doing some deletes at the shop. I can't remember which, but Tracy was convicted. I've done a lot of consulting with Sean and Tracy over the years. And so I'm pretty knowledgeable about their case. They've got a really great defense lawyer who's a public defender. His name is Phil. And I mean, they're like really great people. I like them a lot. But the reason I bring their case up is because they both got into a lot of trouble on the dealership side. So if you're a dealer and you're reselling deleted vehicles, you have a ton of exposure with the EPA, but you have even more exposure with the end user who bought it, who didn't know it was deleted. Because if it doesn't pass emissions and the dealership doesn't take it back or they don't put it back to stock, that's a felony. That can be tampering. So, something to keep in mind.
Great. That definitely answered it and shed some light on some of these questions we've gotten since we chatted last. I appreciate your time today, Stuart, chatting with me about developments through the first almost half of 2025 and
Yeah.
what you're seeing out there. So as always, it was a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, if I see anything earth shattering or anything really important that happens, I'll send you an email and we'll schedule another time to do an update.
Yeah, let me know, or I'm sure I'll bug you if I see something
Yeah,
on
absolutely.
something out there in the news. Thanks again, Stuart.
All right, thanks. Have a good one.
Don't forget, Diesel fans, make sure and head on over to Kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code TDP2540. It'll get you 40% off MSRP. It's a great way to save some money and get some cool gear if you're in the market for a new EDC knife, something for hunting, fishing, around the job site, around the house. They've got you covered with a bunch of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, different opening mechanisms, handle designs, and their whole lineup's designed to meet any budget that you might have. So if you're in the market, make sure and head on over to Kershaw.kaiusa.com and use code TDP2540 for 40% off MSRP. Also want to give a shout out to some of our Patreon supporters: Tyler Lowe and a 23 Diesel, Cutter Up Rob, Robert, all of other Patreon supporters, all of you who subscribe on YouTube and podcast apps. Follow us on social media. We appreciate all your support here in year 9 of the Diesel Podcast and look forward to bringing you more of the content that you want to hear in 2025. Till next time, keep the shiny side up.